Good morning, everyone. Today's class is the continuation of topics in pediatric surgery. In this class, we are going to discuss about anorectal malformations, imperforate anus, invertogram, and meconium ileus. Coming to anorectal malformations, these are the spectrum of diseases of congenital disorders. There's a defective development of the hindgut. The incidence of anorectal malformation is 1 in 4,500 newborns. Embryology. As we know that for any congenital disorders, embryology, we have to know about embryology. This plays an important role to know about the pathogenesis of the underlying disorder. So in case of anorectal malformations, cloaca, a single common chamber, this is divided into two parts by the urorectal septum into the posterior or the dorsal rectum and the ventral or anterior urogenital sinus. In this picture, you will be able to appreciate the urorectal septum. This urorectal septum divides the cloaca, the single chamber, into developing bladder or urinary system, genital system, and the hindgut. This is the anterior urogenital sinus and the posterior rectum. This is the cloacal membrane. The dorsal part of the cloacal membrane, that is the anal membrane, it is composed of an outer layer which is made up of ectoderm and the inner one that is made up of endoderm. Normally during the 8th week of embryology, there will be resorption of this anal membrane, thereby creating the anal canal. See, the hindgut development. This is the hindgut. The membrane is lined, anal membrane is lined by the endoderm in the inner side and the ectoderm on the outer side. Generally, this membrane, like the cloacal or anal membrane, this gets resorbs at around 8th week of gestational age. If there is failure to resorb this layer, this will lead to the formation of persistent anal membrane or imperfect anus. The failure or imperfect fusion of the post-allantoic gut, that is hindgut, with the proctoderm, that is the anal membrane. This leads to the formation of anorectal malformations. There are different classifications for the anorectal malformations. One among them is the wing spread classification. This is the earliest classifications and most widely used one. This is on the basis of according to the level of arrest of rectal descent and the patient's sex. What is meant by this arrest of rectal descent? Whether this rectal descent is arrested above the level of puborectalis or at the level of puborectalis or below the level of puborectalis, wing spread classification is based on that. See, this is the wing spread classification. This is divided into high, intermediate and low, and again in boys and in girls. Okay, high anorectal malformations are those which are above the level of puborectalis. Puborectalis is the part of levator ani muscle. And intermediate anorectal malformations are the malformations at the level of puborectalis, whereas low anorectal malformations are below the level of puborectalis. In boys, it is anorectal agenesis with rectovesical fistula. Rectovesical fistula indicates that there is a fistula or abnormal communication between the rectum and urinary bladder. Sometimes it may be without fistula, and the other entity is rectal ectasia, absence of that distal part of the rectum. In case of girls, the high anorectal malformations include rectovaginal fistula, communication between the rectum and the vagina, and rectal atresia. In case of intermediate, it is rectobulbar urethral fistula. There is a communication between the rectum and bulbar urethra in males, whereas in females, it is rectovestibular fistula. It is communication between the rectum and vestibule. In case of girls, okay, intermediate, it also includes anal agenesis without fistula and rectovaginal fistula. This is the low rectovaginal fistula. Coming to the low anorectal malformations. These low anorectal malformations are the malformations which are below the level of puborectalis. This include anocutaneous fistula and anal stenosis. Anal stenosis is narrowing of the anal canal. In coming to the girls, it includes anovestibular fistula. In case of intermediate, it is rectovestibular fistula. Here it is communication between anus and vestibule. And similarly, anocutaneous fistula and anal stenosis. This is the wing spread classification. In addition to this, there will be also rare malformations, including the cloacal malformation. So, wing spreads classification is based on the level of rectal descent, whether the rectal descent is arrested above the puborectalis high, or at the level of puborectalis intermediate, or low, that is below the level of puborectalis. See, this is the picture showing the puborectalis, which is the part of levator ani. If the anorectal malformations occurs above this level of levator ani or puborectalis, this will be included under the group high anorectal malformations. If at the level of the levator ani or puborectalis muscle, this will be included in the intermediate ones like the rectobulbar fistula or rectovestibular fistula in females. If it is below the level of puborectalis or levator ani, this includes low anorectal malformations like anocutaneous fistulas, anovaginal fistulas, anal stenosis. So this is the classification for the anorectal malformations, that is the wing spreads classifications, earliest classification and most commonly used. There are other n number of classifications like syndromic and non-syndromic and some like Penna's classifications. So coming to syndromic anorectal malformations, this syndromic anorectal malformations means these anorectal malformations are associated with some of the syndromes like Vactral anomaly. I had already discussed about this Vactral anomaly in the tracheoesophageal fistula class. Okay, once again, like V stands for vertebral defects, A for anal atresias or anorectal malformations, C for cardiac defects, T, that is tracheoesophageal fistulas, R stands for renal agenesis or radial limb hypoplasia, L for limb anomalies. So syndromic anorectal malformations are associated with different types of syndromes like Vactral anomalies. So how does the newborn with this anorectal malformations present to you? This newborn presents with inability to pass meconium. See, inability to pass meconium, this clinical feature you will be also seeing in the Hirschsprung's disease also, where there will be delayed passage of meconium. Now, how do you differentiate this anorectal malformation from Hirschsprung's disease, in both of which you will be seeing inability to pass meconium? Whereas in case of Hirschsprung's disease, the anus is present in the normal positions. In case of anorectal malformations, the anus will be absent, or it will be simple dimple or imperfect anus. Sometimes it may be anteriorly shifted anus also. This is how you differentiate between the Hirschsprung's disease and anorectal malformations clinically. So the newborn with anorectal malformations presents with inability to pass meconium and abdominal distension. As the patient, as the newborn is not passing the meconium, there will be abdominal distension and features of intestinal obstruction. On examination, there will be improper anal dimple, or sometimes the anus will be absent, or sometimes it will be shifted anteriorly, that is anterior anus. In some of the conditions like high anorectal malformations, the child, there will be complaints of passing meconium per urethra. This indicates that the defect is above the level of levator anus, indicating it's a high level anorectal malformation. So most common anorectal malformation in boys is rectobulbar fistula, that is communication between the rectum and bulbar urethra, with fistula beginning distal to the puborectalis, that is below the puborectalis from the, or at the level of puborectalis from the distal rectum to the bulbar urethra. There's a communication between the rectum and bulbar urethra. In this picture, you can appreciate this. This is the colon, like sigmoid colon, and this is the rectum, which is communicating with the bulbar urethra. This is the bladder, this is the prostatic urethra, bulbar urethra. So there's a communication, that is recto bulbar urethral fistula, which is the most common type of anorectal malformation in males. Coming to females, the most common anorectal malformation in females is rectovestibular fistula. That is communication between the rectum and the part of vestibule. See, this is the rectovestibular fistula, not rectovaginal fistula. There's an abnormal communication between the rectum and posterior vestibule of vagina. So, the most common type of anorectal malformation in females is rectovestibular fistula. Cloacal malformations. As already discussed, cloaca is a single persistent chamber, the finding of single perineal orifice that indicates the persistent cloaca into which rectum, vagina, urinary tract all will open and they form a common confluence. The longer the common channel, the greater the likelihood of more complex defects that is involving the other systems like urogenital systems, including the vaginal and uterine septations, duplication or atresia. By this time, you might have understand that the embryology or the development of the hindgut, urinary system and genital system is all from the common area. So defect in one system like hindgut, anomalies of the hindgut most of the time is associated with anomalies of the genital system and urinary bladder. See, this is the picture showing the cloaca, the common channel, common opening channel for the, this is the bladder, urinary tract, and this is the uterus for the genital system, reproductive system, and the rectum. So the cloaca is the common channel. Persistent single opening indicates that cloacal malformations. In these pictures, you are able to appreciate the imperforate anus. That is due to the failure of resorption of the anal membrane, there will be persistent anal membrane forming the imperforate anus. So, imperforate anus, it is also known as like anal agenesis or atresia absence. Imperforate anus is one of the entity of the anorectal malformations. Sometimes you can also use the term imperforate anus for anorectal malformations. This is again divided into two types, high and low, on the basis of the termination, level of termination of the rectum in relation to the pelvic floor, that is levator ani muscle. So how do you manage a patient with anorectal malformations? Clinical management. The first important thing is careful perineal examination. I don't know how many of you attended the pediatric postings. As soon as the baby delivered, the pediatrician will come and they will examine all the systems. After keeping the baby in the warmer, they will pass the nasogastric tube, they will examine the genitalia, and they will examine the anal openings. So the most important thing is careful perineal examination. This careful perineal examination itself will give a lot of most important clues about the neonates type of malformations. See, in this picture, you will be able to appreciate that there is no anal opening. This is one of the conditions of anorectal malformation. If there is a meconium on the perineum, presence of the meconium on the perineum, this indicates that mostly the defect is low defect, low lying defect, that is below the level of puborectalis or levator ani muscle. If there is meconium in the urine, it is the evidence of urinary tract fistula, that is high level. So by careful examination of the perineum and urinary system, you will be able to appreciate what type of, you will be able to recognize what type of anomaly is present. So what are the things you have to do during this the first 24 hours? Once you identified there is some problem in the anorectal region or perineal region, then you have to evaluate for other associated congenital anomalies because there's a chance of vectoral anomalies, and you have to supplement with intravenous fluids and antibiotics. Coming to the investigations point, see, invertogram. This is the most important investigation, and it is also a question for you. Invertogram, that is Wangstein's invertogram. This invertogram is nothing but it is an X-ray. It's a plain X-ray. Invertogram is a plain X-ray which is taken in an upside position. So it is as the name itself indicates, it is an inverted position, invertogram. This is taken not immediately after the birth. It should not be taken immediately after the birth. It should be usually taken after 6 to 12 hours after the birth. Why you have to wait for 6 to 12 hours after the birth? Because during this 6 to 12 hours of the birth, the neonate will we will be allowing the neonate to take air, and this air has to reach the distal rectal pouch. If you have taken the x-ray invertogram immediately after the birth, this air will not reach the rectal pouch, and this will give us false results. So this invertogram, which is nothing but a plain x-ray which is taken in an inverted position of the baby, usually done 6 to 12 hours after birth, because it will give the time will allow the air to reach the rectal pouch, and a metal coin or the marker is strapped at the presumed site of anus. On examination, on clinical examination, you will be thinking that this might be site of the anus. At that area you have to place a metal coin or a marker. Then an x-ray is taken. Okay, the length between the rectal pouch, the distal rectal pouch, and the anal dimple marker which you place, if it is the length is more than 2.5 centimeters, then it indicates it's a high anal fistula. If the length between the rectal pouch and the anal dimple marker is more than 2.5 centimeters, then it indicates it's a high anal fistula. In this invertogram, you have to learn about other 2 points like Stephen's line. One is Stephen's line and the other one is Kelly's point. What is Stephen's line? Stephen's line is nothing but a line connecting the coccyx and the pubic. That is pubococcygeal line is the Stephen's line. The other one is the Kelly's point. Kelly's point is nothing but the point at which the ischial spine lies. Okay. So how to read an invertogram? One is if the distal rectal pouch is above the level of pubococcygeal line, it indicates high anal fistulas. If it is at the level of pubococcygeal line, it indicates intermediate anorectal malformations. If it is below the level of pubococcygeal line, then it indicates low anorectal malformations. So in case of invertogram, you have to learn about 2 points, that is Kelly's point at the level of ischial spines. The other one is Stephen's line, which is connecting the pubis and the coccyx, pubococcygeal line. On the basis of this Stephen's line, you will be dividing it into high anorectal malformations if it is above, and intermediate if it is at the level of pubococcygeal line, and if it is below, it is low anorectal malformations. See, this is the picture showing invertogram. Invertogram is nothing but an X-ray taken in inverted position. Plain X-ray usually taken 6 to 12 hours after birth. This is the coccyx, and this is the metal marker which we place, and here it is the pubic bone. This is the femur. Okay, and line connecting the pubis and the coccyx, this will be your Stephen's line. And if this air shadow is below this pubococcygeal line, it indicates it is the low anorectal malformation. Or another way is like if you measure the distance between the metal marker and the distal air shadow, rectal pouch air shadow, if it is more than 2.5 centimeters, it indicates it is a high anorectal malformation. If it is below 2.5 centimeters, it indicates it's a low anorectal malformation. This is about the invertogram. See, low fistula, when you say low fistula, it is the when the rectal pouch is below to the Stephen's line, that is pubococcygeal line. Intermediate anorectal malformations are when the pouch is at the level of ischial spine, that is at the level of Kelly's point. High fistulas are when the rectal pouch is proximal to or above to the Stephen's line, that is high anorectal malformations. And the other important thing is, as these anorectal malformations are associated with other anomalies, you have to order for other investigations like ultrasound abdomen and evaluation of cardiac function and MRI spine to rule out the vertebral anomalies. Now, how do you treat these anorectal malformations, and what is the prognosis of anorectal malformations? The prognosis depends upon the type of anorectal malformation, whether it is low anorectal malformations or high anorectal malformation. Similarly, the treatment is also based on the type of anorectal malformation. The associated abnormalities of sacrum, that is vertebral defects, and genitourinary systems, and the site of defect, all this play an important role in the treatment and prognosis. If the level of rectal pouch and the normal or abnormal sacrum are the deciding factors for the good results. Low defects, that is the defects which are below the level of levator ani muscle, they are relatively easy to correct, but these defects after correction are prone for constipation. Whereas high defects, that is above the level of levator ani, they are more difficult to correct. They are more complex fistulas or complex anorectal malformations, and after correction, they are prone for incontinence, fecal incontinence. So coming to the treatment point, low anorectal malformations or low fistulas, the correction is, it is single stage reconstruction. At one stage, we can correct this anomalies. Usually, anal dilatation includes, the treatment options includes anal dilatations. For anal stenosis, we go for anal dilatation. If there is persistent anal membrane, then you will incise the anal membrane, that is incision of anal membrane. And anoplasty, if there is anteriorly shifted anals or anal agenesis, then you go for analplasty. And if there is associated defect in the vestibule also, then you will go for anovestibuloplasty. So the treatment options for low level anorectal malformations is single stage reconstruction. You can do it at a time. The options include anal dilatation, incision of anal membrane, anoplasty, anovestibuloplasty. Coming to the high anorectal malformations or high lying fistulas, the treatment is staged procedure. Initially, you have to do colostomy, that is bringing out the stoma outside, initial colostomy, then definitive procedure. The definitive procedure includes pull-through option through puborectalis, the muscle, and anastomosis of distal pouch to create the anal canal is done, and posterior sagittal anorectoplasty. This is the most common procedure we will do for high anorectal malformation, that is posterior sagittal anorectoplasty. After the definitive procedure is completed, then the closure of colostomy has to be done. So this is a picture showing the posterior sagittal anorectoplasty. Here any communication with the urinary bladder has to be ligated, followed by pull-through operation and the repair. Okay. So for the high level anorectal malformations, the surgery includes staged procedures. Initially, colostomy has to be done. Later, definitive procedures. This definitive procedures includes the pull-through options and posterior sagittal anorectoplasty. And in the later stage, you have to go for colostomy. In case of girls, if there is cloaca or common channel anomalies, and in such cases, urinary and vaginal reconstruction has to be required. Urinary and vaginal reconstruction. What are the complications of these surgeries? Infections, fecal fistula, stenosis, colitis, malnutrition, fecal incontinence. Okay, this ends up the anorectal malformations. To summarize anorectal malformations, these are the congenital problems which is classified into two types, like low and high, intermediate also, on the basis of the pelvic floor or levator ani muscles. And invertogram is the investigation. It is nothing but a plain x-ray taken in an inverted position. And coming to the treatment options, for the low lying fistula, single stage procedures, and for the high level, it is the staged procedures, initial colostomy followed by the definitive procedure, and the prognosis is good for the low lying fistulas. Coming to the next topic, that is meconium ileus. See, in this picture you will be seeing that this is the cecum appendix ascending colon, whereas this is the ileum, terminal ileum. In the terminal ileums, there is the meconium pellets. These are all the meconium pellets, and this is the dilated terminal ileum. Okay. So meconium ileus is the neonatal manifestation of fibrocystic disease of pancreas. Meconium ileus is a neonatal manifestation of fibrocystic disease of pancreas. By definition, you can say like it is in terminal ileum becomes filled with thick viscoid meconium that result in the progressive intestinal obstruction. So meconium ileus is one of the cause for neonatal obstruction, and it is one of the manifestation of the fibrocystic disease of pancreas, in which the terminal ileum will be filled with thick viscoid meconium. This paste-like meconium will be filled up in the terminal ileum, causing the intestinal obstruction. See, in this diagram, this is the normal colon, the outline one, the normal colon, and this is the terminal ileum where the thick viscoid paste-like meconium will be accumulated, causing obstruction or dilatation of the small intestine. This is the small intestine, dilated small intestine. And this is the cecum, ascending colon, and the transverse colon, and the descending colon. Compared to the normal colon, this colon in meconium ileus will be narrow one, small in diameter, because here we are not using the colon. This is the unused colon, microcolon, compared to the normal one. So here the meconium is filled in the terminal ileum, causing dilatation of the proximal ileum and unused of the narrow colon. Cystic fibrosis. This is almost always the underlying cause for meconium ileus. Meconium ileus, the underlying cause for most of the cases it is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is due to autosomal recessive genetic defect. Due to the gene defect, that is cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene, which is located in the chromosome 7 long arm, that is Q. This cystic fibrosis involves bronchioles, exocrine pancreas, and sweat glands. What is the pathogenesis for meconium ileus? This pathogenesis or this event it usually begins in utero only. There are two events which are occurring simultaneously. One is development of pancreatic exocrine enzyme deficiency. There is pancreatic exocrine enzyme deficiency. Normally, the pancreatic enzymes are used to keep meconium in its normal form. As there is a deficiency of this pancreatic enzymes, the meconium will become more thick, more viscid. And the second theory is secretion of hyperviscous mucus. There is secretion of abnormal mucus by pathologically abnormal intestinal glands. See, cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis, this is an autosomal recessive disease involving the cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene in the chromosome 7 of long arm Q. Okay, this cystic fibrosis involves bronchioles. So the bronchioles, there will be abnormal ciliae and the mucus will be accumulated, and mostly this cystic fibrosis patients will be presenting with recurrent upper respiratory tract infections, bronchiectasis. Coming to the pancreas involvement, there will be exocrine pancreatic enzyme deficiency leading to malnutrition, indigestion, and blocking of the pancreatic ducts and the bile duct. So meconium ileus, it is the earliest manifestation of cystic fibrosis, and it is reported as presenting feature. Meconium ileus is the presenting feature in 15% of cystic fibrosis population. Exocrine pancreatic insufficiency and malabsorption is seen in 90% of patients with cystic fibrosis. So normal, how does the normal meconium and meconium in meconium ileus patients differs? Meconium is normally kept fluid by the action of pancreatic enzymes. As we know that this pancreatic enzymes deficiency is present in the patients of meconium ileus. The meconium in meconium ileus, it will be less water content, So it will be thick, paste-like and viscoid. And decreased pancreatic enzyme levels and increased albumin. All this will lead to thick meconium, which gets accumulated in the terminal ileum. So pathology, the proximal ileum, there will be hypertrophy and dilatation containing the thick viscoid tenacious dark green meconium in the proximal ileum. Whereas coming to the terminal or the distal ileum and colon, it will be narrow and contracted, having the meconium pellets. This meconium gets calcified very rapidly because of the absence of the pancreatic enzymes. See. This is the picture showing the appendix cecum terminal ileum, where there is a sticky, thick, viscoid paste-like meconium in the terminal ileum. This will, as the neonate gets dehydrated, it will be forming the meconium pellets, and this will cause the proximal obstruction, causing the dilated a dilated proximal ileum and contracted terminal ileum, and the colon will be unused microcolon. This is all the unused microcolon. As the meconium gets calcified rapidly, this we can see calcifications also, and there will be secondary atresia of the terminal ileum, and sometimes there will be perforation. Coming to the clinical features of the meconium ileus. How does a patient of meconium ileus present to you? They will be presenting with the features of ileal obstruction because the whole pathology lies in the terminal ileum. So they will be presenting with the features of ileal obstruction, and also if associated with cystic fibrosis, there will be respiratory dysfunctions, that is abnormal ciliary clearance, recurrent respiratory infections, bronchiectasis, and exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, and high salt in the sweat. This is the picture showing the neonate with meconium ileus, where you can see the distended stomach with visible bowel loops. These are all the visible bowel loops. What are the features of ileal obstruction? The abdominal distension at birth. Before the neonate swallows itself, there will be abdominal distension, because in case of meconium ileus, the pathogenesis will be starting in utero, inside the in uterus only. Okay, and you can also see the visible peristalsis. Visible dilated loops of bowel are often palpable. These bowel loops are duffy in consistency in newborn with meconium ileus. These are the features of the ileal obstruction. There is another term like meconium peritonitis, fetal meconium peritonitis. What is meant by this fetal meconium peritonitis? As we already know that the pathology or the pathogenesis of the meconium ileus starts in utero. Because of the obstruction, it can lead to intrauterine perforation. This intrauterine perforation causes meconium peritonitis, leads to dense adhesions and calcifications in the peritoneum. There will be adhesions and calcifications in the peritoneum. The important of this fetal meconium peritonitis is it is a sterile condition. It's not infective. It is a sterile. Meconium peritonitis is a sterile, and it can be classified like adhesive type. That is, because of adhesions, there will be limited peritonitis at one part, or generalized peritonitis, pseudocyst, that is cystic formation of the meconium. So these are the different types of fetal meconium peritonitis, which occurs due to intrauterine perforation. This leads to dense adhesions and calcifications in peritoneum. And this fetal meconium peritonitis is a sterile condition. It's not infective. It is a sterile condition as it occurs inside the womb, and the different types are adhesive, generalized, and pseudocyst. What are the complications of meconium ileus? Once, because of this terminal ileum gets obstructed, it leads to intestinal obstruction, which later can form gangrene, volvulus. Once gangrene is formed, it leads to perforation and peritonitis. See, this one atresia, secondary atresia, and this is the volvulus condition and perforation. So what is the management for meconium ileus? As we know that most of the conditions of meconium, in most of the cases of meconium ileus is associated with cystic fibrosis. Taking the family history is very important. One is family history, the other one is gene mutation analysis. That is for chromosome 7 for gene cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene. Gene mutation analysis is important. The other important investigation is sweat test. That is by using pilocarpine. It's a drug that is cholinergic drug. Pilocarpine iontophoresis. When this pilocarpine is injected into the skin, it stimulates sweating. This sweat has to be collected and we have to analyze it for sodium and chloride. The minimum amount of sweat to be collected is 100 mg, and this collection can be done from the forearm, leg or back. And if the sweat test shows elevated sodium and chloride more than 70 millimoles per liter, it indicates that the neonate is suffering from the cystic fibrosis. So this is about sweat test. Generally the sweat we have to stimulate the sweating by using the pilocarpine drug, that is pilocarpine iontophoresis. And this sweat test, if the levels of sodium or chloride are more than 70 millimoles per liter, indicates it's a positive and the infant is suffering from the cystic fibrosis. The other important investigation or the basic investigation is the plain X-ray. In the X-ray, you will be seeing the dilated small intestine with Montfling, and fluid levels are generally not seen. See, in this obstruction, the fluid levels are not seen. We will see only dilated small intestine. Unlike ileal atresia, one of the differential diagnoses for meconium ileus is ileal atresia, that is absence of terminal ileum. See, this ileal atresia is the primary ileal atresia, whereas meconium ileus can lead to secondary terminal ileum atresia. In this ileal atresia, there will be abrupt termination of gas-filled intestine. Suddenly, there will be cut off from the ileum and the cecum. However, in case of meconium ileus, there will not be abrupt termination of gas-filled intestine. So, in the plain X-ray, in case of meconium ileus, you will be seen dilated small intestine with mottling. Fluid levels are generally not seen, and unlike terminal atresia, unlike the terminal ileal atresia, there will be no abrupt termination. See, this is an X-ray. All these dilated loops are small intestine loops. All these are small intestine. We are not seeing the large intestine. And we will be rarely appreciating any air fluid levels. This is the dilated small intestine. Sometimes you will be also seeing the calcified meconium pellets with multiple air fluid levels. Once the air enters, then this gives the soap bubble appearance. This is Nauhauser sign. Soap bubbles in X-ray indicates it's a Nauhauser sign, which is because of mixing of meconium with air. It gives a soap bubble appearance. See, this is the picture. This is the soap bubbles. Because of mixing the meconium and air, we will be seeing like soap bubble appearance, and these are the calcified meconium pellets. There is also other test, that is vomiters of the patient which does not contain trypsin. As in case of meconium ileus, if the underlying cause is cystic fibrosis, there will be deficiency of the pancreatic enzymes like trypsin. If this vomiters of this patient with meconium ileus which does not contain trypsin, when poured on the exposed X-ray film, it will not be digested. It will not digest the gelatin, whereas vomiters of the individual with normal pancreas, which is containing trypsin, will digest the gelatin. This is a useful test, right? Because this indicates that exocrine pancreatic abnormality. Another investigation is barium enema or the contrast enema. Contrast enema. This shows the unused microcolon. See, this is all the colon. See, are you able to appreciate the diameter which is very narrowed? This is the unused microcolon which you will be seeing in the contrast barium enema. The other investigations, these are the investigations to evaluate the cystic fibrosis, that is elevated albumin level in meconium, sodium level assay in nail clipping, serum immune active trypsin assay. Coming to the treatment point, investigations are like X-ray, in which you will be seeing the dilated small bowel, soap bubble appearance, and calcified meconium pellets. And barium contrast, you will be seeing the microcolon. Coming to the treatment point, this meconium ileus is classified into two types. One is uncomplicated or simple meconium ileus. Uncomplicated or simple meconium ileus. The other entity is complicated or complex meconium ileus. For the simple meconium ileus, the treatment option is conservative management. Whereas for the complex meconium ileus or the complicated one, the treatment option is surgery. So coming to simple or uncomplicated meconium ileus, the treatment is by hyperosmolar gastrografin enema. What is this gastrografin? Gastrografin is a diatriazide meglam with the TEAN 80 or polysorbate 80. This polysorbate 80 is an emulsifier or it is a stabilizer, whereas gastrografin, it is a dissolving, it is used to draw fluid into the gut lumen by its hyperosmolarity effect, and its detergent properties liquefy the meconium. So in case of simple meconium ileus or the uncomplicated meconium ileus, treatment option is hyperosmolar gastrografin enema. See, this one is the gastrografin. Here enema, hyperosmolar gastrografin enema. Once you have given or you have treated with hyperosmolar gastrografin enema, the fluid has to be replaced. As this enema leads to the dehydration, you have to supplement with intravenous fluids to compensate for fluid shifts. So if the simple meconium ileus, if treated with hyperosmolar gastrografin enema, after the treatment, they should be supplemented with extra intravenous fluids to compensate for fluid shifts. Coming to the treatment of complicated or complex meconium ileus. What is this complicated or complex meconium ileus? If it is complicated with some of the surgical points like intestinal perforation, volvulus, atresia, or it is unresponsive to enemas, all these are classified under complicated or complex meconium ileus. Various surgical procedures for this complicated cases. Enterotomy and irrigation of bowel. One is enterotomy, with that is opening of the terminal ileum and irrigation of the bowel. The second option is intestinal resection and temporary stoma formation. And the third one is resection and primary anastomosis. See, the present standard surgical approach is enterotomy with irrigation of the bowel. Enterotomy is opening of the bowel and you have to irrigate with warm normal saline or 4% N-acetyl cysteine. This N-acetyl cysteine will dissolve or dilute the meconium, and complete evacuation of all meconium pellets, or they can be pushed down into large bowel manually, and then after completion of this there will be closure of the enterotomy. See, this is the picture. This is the terminal ileum which is filled with the meconium. So you have to open in the ileum and a tube is passed. Enterotomy with the irrigation, tube is passed, and you have to irrigate with normal saline and 4% N-acetyl cysteine. This N-acetyl cysteine, how does it work? It by breaking the disulfide bonds of meconium, it dissolves or it separates the meconium from intestinal mucosa, allowing its removal. Okay, and a tube can be placed in small bowl through which this N-acetyl cysteine wash can be given repeatedly. If it needs further dissolution, then a tube can be left in situ. The other treatment option is resection and primary anastomosis. This is the ideal one. If the patient is fit and the proximal bowel is suitable for anastomosis, then you can go for resection and anastomosis. The other operative procedures are resection and temporary stoma formation. See, Bishop-Hooke's operation. In this, the proximal dilated segment is resected. The proximal dilated segment is resected and distal ileum is brought as ileostomy, and end to side anastomosis is done. See, this is the distal ileum. This distal ileum is brought as ileostomy. This is brought outside, stoma formation, and proximal bowel which is dilated is resected. It is cut and it is done, anastomosis is done end with the side anastomosis. So Bishop Hook operation is the surgery for meconium ileus, which are complicated ones. In this, the proximal dilated segment is resected, it is cut, and an end to side anastomosis is done, and distal ileum is brought as ileostomy. The other surgery is Santulin's operation, in which the proximal ileum is brought as ileostomy. In this, the proximal bowel ileum is brought as ileostomy, and end to side anastomosis is done with the distal ileum. What are the advantages of ileostomy? What is the need for keeping the stoma? If you want to give the gastrografin or N-acetyl cysteine wash, you can give through this ileostomy, and after this can be, stoma can be kept for long time, and afterwards you can close the ileostomy. So coming to the treatment of the meconium ileus, this meconium ileus is divided into two types, like simple meconium ileus and the complex meconium ileus. For the simple meconium ileus or the uncomplicated meconium ileus, it is non-operative management or conservative management using hyperosmolar gastrografin enema. For the complex or complicated meconium ileus, which includes volvulus, atresia, interstitial perforation, then surgery is the treatment option. In the surgery also, there will be various procedures. One is like enterotomy, opening and irrigation of the bowel. The other one is intestinal resection and temporary stoma formation. The Bishop Hook's surgery and Santulin's procedure will come under this. And the third one is resection and primary anastomosis. So this ends up the meconium ileus. To summarize meconium ileus, this is one of the important cause for neonatal obstruction, and cystic fibrosis is almost always the underlying cause. And the coming to the investigative part, X-ray. In the X-ray, you will see soap bubble appearance and calcified meconium pellets, and other investigations to rule out cystic fibrosis like sweat test, vomitus, trypsin test, and treatment options for the simple meconium ileus is non-operative management, and for complicated meconium ileus, it is surgery. Any doubts? ఒకసారి రండి. ఇదేదో వచ్చింది. If you have any questions, you can ask. I think you are having the exam in the coming Saturday. Okay. One of the question. Uh, One doubt is like, is hyperosmolar gastrographin enema initial option for meconium ileus? See, I will not say that it is an initial option for meconium ileus, as I had already explained you that meconium ileus is classified into two types. One is simple meconium ileus and the other one is complicated or complex meconium ileus. If it is a simple meconium ileus, then you can go for hyperosmolar gastrographin enema depending upon the patient's conditions. If the patient is clinically stable and if it is only and adequately hydrated and optimized, then you can, if it is a simple meconium ileus, then you can go for hyperosmolar gastrographin enema. But if it is a complex meconium ileus, it's not that initially you should give hyperosmolar gastrographin enema and then try for surgery. If it is a complex case or if it is a complicated with some surgical point like volvulus atresia, then you have to go directly to the surgery itself after optimizing the neonate. Any other doubts? So this Saturday you are having the exam. So I just want to tell that in the pediatric surgery topics, we have covered 5 topics in the last classes. One is like IHPS, that is infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis or congenital pyloric stenosis, and the others are like Hirschsprung's disease, tracheoesophageal fistula, intussusception, Meckel's diverticulum. Just study about that, and all the best for your exam on Saturday. I think we can end up this session. Thank you.